So my name's Clara, and I'm joined by my colleague Anya, who's running the tech side of things. So if you've got any problems during the webinar, please give us a shout. And just before I introduce our speaker, I will just speak to you about how we'll work today. So the slides and the recording of this will be made available, so you can share it and sort of relax and enjoy the talk, and without worrying about having to take any notes or anything. Please keep yourself on mute just whilst people are talking, and if you would like to put any questions you have for our speaker in the chat function, we can try and answer those questions either in real time or after the presentation. And also at the end, if hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion and a question and answer session, so do please feel free to turn on your cameras and microphone at that point if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Clara Strauss, who's a consultant clinical psychologist and Deputy Director of Research at Sussex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust, and a Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Sussex. Thank you so much for joining us, Clara.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Really good to see so many of you here. So I've got some slides I was going to share, and then we can just have some chance just for questions and answers. So I'll start by sharing my slides. Hopefully you can see that okay. Okay, so I wasn't going to spend ages sort of talking, so we've got a bit more time for kind of questions, but I was just going to kind of go through my own research journey, and then I suppose through doing this, I've also, it's been quite interesting because it's also helped me kind of reflect on my journey in a way that I suppose I don't normally do. So what I've also done is kind of thought about looking back at what are some of the things that kind of facilitated my journey to share with you, to see if those are helpful, and then really happy to take any questions. So in terms of my journey kind of mapped out, I'll say a little bit about kind of my background and over the past several years now. So kind of did my undergraduate degree in applied psychology at the University of Sussex back in the 90s and graduated in 1997, and really enjoyed that. It was applied psychology, so kind of had a real even at that point was a focus on how to apply psychological theory and research to clinical settings. And it was at that point, it was during my degree, that I kind of decided that I'd really wanted to kind of pursue a career in clinical psychology if I could. But I was also very interested in research. So in fact, before I applied for clinical psychology training, I stayed at Sussex and did a PhD in psychology, and that was on cognitive factors in childhood depression. So I spent the next 4 years staying at Sussex, doing a PhD, and then applying to do a clinical psychology training program at Salomons, which some of you may know is one of the clinical psychology training programs up in Tunbridge Wells. And there are various routes onto clinical psychology doctoral training, and one of them is through doing a PhD. So it's not the most usual route, but there's certainly a number of people who will do a PhD as their route onto clinical psychology training. So I graduated as a clinical psychologist from Salomons in 2004 and took up my first clinical psychology kind of full-time post in the NHS in 2004 in what was then, I can't remember what it was called, West Sussex Health and Social Care Trust, but it basically is what is now Sussex Partnerships. It was a predecessor to Sussex Partnerships. So I've never left the region. I like it down here. So I sort of worked as a clinical psychologist in adult mental health services, so in services for adults experiencing psychosis, and then a specialist psychological therapy service for the next 10 years. And I'm going to talk a bit more about how during that time, how I kind of got into kind of research during that time. And I was sort of a jobbing kind of clinical psychologist, which I really loved. But I had a real hankering for research. And I guess where that came from was and I guess for all of you, you're probably in the same position, that you kind of, when you're working in the NHS as a clinician, you kind of are, or at least I was aware, and I guess that most of you are aware, that the things that we offer to people who use our services aren't always effective for everyone. And often some of the things and for some people, we can really get the sense of actually we don't have much to offer that's very effective. So I found that quite frustrating, and I wanted to be able to know actually, for this group of people, why aren't the therapies or the treatments that we're offering more effective? And really knowing that research is a really good way of answering those questions, and hopefully finding better, better treatments, creating better services. And I have a real sense that actually doing that through research is a really good way of doing that, because we've got some really good research methods to allow us to answer those questions to helpfully improve services. So in that 6-year period, when I was sort of a full-time clinical psychologist, I kind of wanted more and more to get involved in research to address some of those questions. But it was quite difficult to do because there's not lots of research posts around. So what I ended up doing was going back onto a clinical psychology training program, but into a research tutor post. So certainly from a clinical psychology perspective, all of the training courses obviously employ people to work on the programs to train the new trainees. And I'm, and I know that's the same for all of the healthcare profession training courses. So in fact, in my experience, going back onto a training course was quite a good, and those are the positions that aren't that competitive. They're not that difficult to get into. So that was a way for me to be in I suppose in a research position at a university, but at a time when I wouldn't have been competitive. Let's say if I'd applied for like a standard academic position, I wouldn't have had the CV that would have allowed me to do that. But as a research tutor and then the research director on the clinical psychology training program at the University of Surrey, this was it gave me the opportunity to spend a lot of time working with other research tutors, learning from them, and supervising the trainees doing their research projects. And in fact, it was through supervising their projects, and each year I'd supervise maybe half a dozen trainees, and there were 3 years. So at any one time I might be supervising sort of 10 to 15 trainee projects. And it was a brilliant way of just learning a lot of research methods, because I was supposed to be the expert, so I was having to go away and learn stuff and pass that on. And also I was very fortunate that I generally supervised just some amazing kind of trainees as well, so I learned a lot from them as well. So that was a really good way of kind of and I did that, I should say, that was 3 days a week. So I was staying in the NHS 2 days a week, but that was a really good way of just really kind of massively developing my kind of NHS research skills. I'd say in that 3-year period I was there. I then moved from my clinical post in the NHS into a post in the R&D department, where I'm still based, so the Research and Development Department in Sussex Partnership, as a clinical research fellow for 2 days a week, and I'm still there now. I got an honorary position when I left Surrey. I didn't want to lose the connections with being at a university, so I left the Surrey course in 2013 and back into the NHS full time, but in the R&D department at this point as a clinical research fellow. But I didn't want to lose my kind of connections with being a part of faculty, being part of the university. I really loved being in that environment. There's lots of advantages to being in that environment. So I had an honorary position there, which basically means that I can have some access to some of the library and various bits and pieces through the university. I supervised some PhD students and master's students, but I wasn't given a salary for that. But I did that within my NHS time, and that's not unusual for that sort of arrangement to be made. And then I then last year was given a full position, just 1 day a week, as faculty in the School of Psychology at the University of Sussex, which is really exciting. And I've stayed and now I'm 4 days a week in the R&D department. So that's sort of, in terms of the job roles I've been in, I hope that gives a bit of a flavour about my journey. And then what I wanted to spend the rest of the time talking about really was the kind of just reflecting on what's facilitated my journey over the past few years. I'd be really interested to hear what thoughts are. I think one of the very first things I did when I was in my full-time clinical psychology post, like I said, I was really hungry to get involved in research. I spoke to some people who already were involved in research, and the bit of advice I was really given was don't try and do this on your own. And that's probably the bit of advice I'd give everyone here. I think it's pretty impossible to do research in the NHS on your own. I know virtually nobody who does that. And I was really fortunate in 2006 to be given the opportunity to join an existing research team, quite a large research team led by Paul Chadwick, who's now, I think, the clinical psychology course director at the University of Bath, who some of you may know has kind of, really one of the leading figures in developing CBT for psychosis. So he was doing some research around that, and well, still is, but certainly was then. So I joined a research team led by Paul back in 2006, originally as a therapist, actually, on one of his studies, but then kind of managed to wangle my way into some of the research team meetings and just loved it. I just loved being part of those discussions, which were exactly the thing I was just saying about, that I was really hungry for, this idea of, the therapies we're offering to people with psychosis aren't helpful for lots of people don't engage, lots of people don't benefit. How can we improve on them? And those were exactly the sort of questions Paul and his team were interested in. So I gradually became part of that research team, and that research team really stayed together for the next 10 years. So we kind of did research together over the next 10 years on kind of developing and evaluating Paul's particular approach to CBT for psychosis, which I really love doing. And generally since then, and as I've developed, what I'd say, I suppose, in terms of my experience is I've been part of lots of research teams, small teams and large teams throughout my career. Sometimes I'm a member of the team, which is led by somebody else. It's probably worth saying that within a research team, there's usually somebody, a person who's the lead for that team, who might be the chief investigator, they'd be typically called. Sometimes there are joint chief investigators, but you wouldn't usually get more than 2 people, and even 2 people leading a team's more unusual. So usually you've got 1 person leading. So sometimes I've led a team, sometimes I've been part of a team, but like I said, I've never researched on my own. I've always researched with other people. And sometimes those teams are large teams, with, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of research funding to, let's say, run a randomized controlled trial of a particular psychological intervention across multiple NHS trusts. Sometimes a team might be quite small, and by team it might be a PhD student who I'm co-supervising with one of my colleagues. So there might be me and my colleague and a PhD student, and maybe a master's student who's part of that team. So sometimes the teams can be quite small, and maybe it's part of a PhD or a master's thesis. Sometimes the team can be, like I said, really, can have a dozen or more people on it. So I've really loved that. I've learned so much from doing that. So that comes on to my next point. I'd say I've learned pretty much everything I've learned, not from kind of reading books about how to do research in the NHS, but just from, I suppose, being mentored informally by people who've gone through the journey ahead of me. So learning from people who've done this and being in meetings with them, asking them questions, incredibly grateful to those people who've shared that with me. So what I'd say is, I suppose my experience has been being part of an existing, joining, finding a research team who's researching something that I'm interested in and that's relevant to what I'm doing clinically, and learning just by being part of the team, just learning, and I just think that experience I've gained has been absolutely invaluable, and I'm still learning a lot. And I imagine, I don't ever want to stop learning either. I think I'd be a bit bored then, but also, I'm aware there's so much more that I need to learn. So I by no means need to, there's lots I don't know. There's probably more that I don't know than I do know. So so that'll be my first just bit of advice or suggestion, at least from my own experience, is to find people researching who are in the area you're interested in, and see if you're not already, seeing if you can join their research team in some way, shape or form, and offering, seeing what could you offer them, because I guess they're going to want something in return. What could you offer them? Could you support with recruitment, or with writing up any papers or doing any literature searching or any, what could you offer to that team in return? Which brings me on to the next thing, which I'm sure you're then sitting, when am I going to do that? So time has been a really good facilitator for me. And I think I was lucky in comparison maybe to some of you to come into the NHS at a time when the NHS wasn't in meltdown, for want of a better, and wasn't in crisis really. And I do, there is something about the context, which I'm sure will come up today, that it's really, really hard at the moment in the NHS at the moment. And I came into the NHS at the time when funding was being increased, I think at unprecedented levels. And I was given half a day a week to pursue my own research interest in my first clinical position, without really needing to make much of a case for that. I sort of asked my line manager and I was given that, and it wasn't a big deal. I think now that might be much, much harder to negotiate, if not impossible to negotiate. I think if I hadn't had that, which then gave me the opportunity, say, to join Paul Chadwick's research team, I might not have been on the journey I'm talking about today. So I am really aware of the differences in context between now and then. I think the other thing that gave me time, like I said, was moving out of being a full-time clinician into onto one of the onto a clinical psychology training course, but that might apply to any kind of healthcare training course, depending on what your profession is, because that just gave me time to be teaching trainees, learning from them, being able to supervise their research projects. The other thing that gave me time was beginning in 2010 to start applying for really small pots of money. So you may be aware there are big funding streams from NIHR that are around. They're quite competitive, but sometimes there are really small amounts of funding that are available to apply for, sometimes just in-house funding, so just sometimes within the trust or within a small organisation that's less competitive, that's easier to get. But what that funding can do, again, with your agreement of your manager, is maybe buy out a bit of your time, maybe half a day a week of your time to be involved in that research study. And then obviously could then, once I was able to do that, I then could demonstrate that I had a track record of getting funding, so then I could apply for slightly larger pots of funding. I then moved into a clinical research fellow post in the R&D department in SPFT. And there are very few of those posts about in NHS services. So I think I'm just very fortunate. Again, I think that was a bit of a matter of being in the right time at the right place, that Sussex Partnership are quite unusual in having some posts for clinical academics. So I was really fortunate to be given that opportunity. And then, like I said, I moved into a university, a formal faculty position last year. But there's also some reality about time. A lot of the work I was doing, so writing grants, writing papers, was done in evenings and weekends, which I don't think is a good model. I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm just saying that's what I did. I do think research should be, in my view, seen as an important clinical activity as clinical work, because it is about improving services and improving outcomes. But there's also something about the reality. So other facilitators, I suppose, thinking back, was just spending lots of time on thinking of, this might seem obvious, but certainly when I speak to people, sometimes these steps haven't been gone through. So I'll often speak to people, clinicians, who kind of have got brilliant ideas for research, from their own clinical experience, so drawing on their own clinical experience, the own difficulties they're encountering in their services, have lots of brilliant ideas. But I think there's some really important questions before like an idea for like, oh, this would be something interesting to study. I think they're just some really important questions to ask yourself before you think, is this actually a goer? Is this something I could actually get some funding for? Either funding as a research study or funding to do a fellowship, for example. Firstly, it's kind of clarifying, what is the problem in your service that you're trying to solve? Is that a problem that you can really demonstrate? Kind of, are there facts and figures you can demonstrate that? And really importantly, what do people who use your services think of that? Is it a problem from their perspective? Do they think that's a really key problem? More and more, and quite rightly, NIHR and other funders are taking what people who PPI, so patient public involvement, what people who use services, perspectives on what are important research questions incredibly seriously, so I think it's not only, and that, it's not, but this also isn't about paying lip service. Obviously, why would you try to solve a problem if people who use the services don't think it's a problem? So it's the right thing to do. I think the second thing is, the second step I've got here is, in my experience, often the thing that can get missed. So you can think, oh, this is a problem that I want to solve. It's genuinely a problem in my service. I want to do this study. But when I've done that, and I think, oh, I've come up with this problem that I think no one else has looked at, and then I go away and look a bit at what's been published, I realize actually somebody else has done some really good research in that area and their findings just aren't being applied. And I think that probably happens much more often than not. So when I come up with an idea for a research study that I think is novel and no one else has thought about this, I'd say more often than not, when I go away and look, I've had other people have looked at it, and the problem is about implementation. The problem is actually the NHS are not very good at implementing research findings into practice. So really investing a lot of time in really finding out, has somebody done this before? Because you're not going to get funded to do a study that somebody else has done. So you really need to, and if you're not confident with doing literature reviews, the library services in your trust are really good at actually doing some searches for you. A lot of the library services will actually just do the search, but also training you in how to do searches. Then when you've done the search, when you've looked at what else has been published, you can ask yourself the question, actually, when it comes to this problem I'm trying to solve, is there a gap in what we know? Is there some research that hasn't been done that's really important? And then do I have a good and plausible solution that might actually address that problem? So how am I going to address that gap? What do people who use services think of my solutions if they think that seems plausible? Okay, so what I'd say there is, just really giving a lot of time to these initial steps of actually, what is my idea? Because I think in my own experience, I've often gone from having an idea to beginning to plan a study without going through these steps, and then you kind of go, and then you realize halfway through writing a funding bid that actually what you're doing isn't so novel. And this is just an example of a study that Clara was involved in as well, that gives an example of that. So this is when we were trying to solve the problem of why people with OCD, only about 50% of people with OCD benefit from the NICE recommended primary intervention, which is cognitive behavior therapy. So about 50% of people don't benefit. So that was the problem we were trying to solve with, again, consulting with PPI. We wondered whether adding mindfulness, a mindfulness-based intervention of component to CBT might help to improve outcomes. There wasn't much research in that area. That was really plausible, that with lots of good theoretical reasons why adding mindfulness might help. And so we got some funding from RFPB, the Research for Patient Benefit stream of NIHR, and published this study. Well, in fact, we found that actually adding mindfulness to CBT didn't seem to make much of a difference to outcomes. So that's a really nice example of, and I'll come on to this in a bit, about how research and the implications of research is sometimes it's finding out the things that maybe don't work as well as the things that do, but they both have really important implications for practice, for what we actually do in services, because in services, the NHS is really stretched. So in my view, we shouldn't be spending time in the NHS on interventions that aren't helpful. Other things massively facilitates research funding, because research funding not only can buy out some of your time, but it can bring a team together. It can buy research assistant time and funding for other academics to come on board, for statisticians, for qualitative experts, it can buy out the time of people with lived experience. So getting research funding, whether that's for a specific project idea, like for research for a patient benefit, or whether that's for doing a PhD, applying for research funding is, again, reflecting back over my career, is one of the things that's really, again, I couldn't have done really anything that I've done without funding in place. So I think the main message, thinking back, is just being persistent. and being patient, I suppose I should add to that as well. It takes a lot of time from having your initial kind of hunch of a research idea to getting the funding to actually starting recruitment to a study. You might be looking at 18 to 24 months. So, you know, you might need to rely on at least 6 months to write a research funding bid. You then may be awaiting another 6 months to hear the outcome. If it's successful, you might be waiting another 6 months to sign all the paperwork and all the contracts and apply for ethics approvals. So you can see how it's, if you have an idea for a research study, it's not going to be starting, and you're looking for funding, it likely won't be starting this year. So it's sort of planning ahead. Funding bids I've been involved in tend to, the majority have been unsuccessful. And I think that's true of everyone else I've spoken to who applies for funding. So there's something around, being persistent and I suppose not letting that get you down, sort of knowing from the outset that most bids for research funding aren't successful. Claire and others can give you a more precise figure, but the kind of figure I've seen banded around across all of the NIHR streams is that the success rate of funding bids is around 20%. It's about 1 in 5 bids that go into NIHR are successful, and often the quality of bids that go into NIHR are really good. People have spent months working on them, have had huge amounts of input. So, really, really good bids sometimes don't get funded. So if a funding bid isn't successful, I suppose reflecting on what I've learned, I think it's about going back, looking at the comments on that, not just putting it in the bin and feeling a bit dejected, although you can do that for a bit of time, but maybe then getting it out of the bin and thinking, actually, is there something here? Is there some feedback that suggests there are some strengths here that I could build on? You can rejig the bid, you can resubmit it to the same funder or to a different funder. Remembering again, not doing this on your own, bringing in other people, having a team. And when I say about doing this collaboratively, it's a team of other clinicians, other academics who've got expertise in the area, statisticians, methodologists, qualitative researchers, people with lived experience, building a whole team around a project. And last but not least, linking in and signing up with a research design service for a project to get some support, which again I've found invaluable. And again, I wouldn't have done without the support from Claire in particular. I'll name drop Claire, who's here, who's been just given me amazing advice over the years on how to strengthen the bids that I've been sort of putting together. And again, couldn't have done it without you, Claire, so thank you for that. Publication is another facilitator, and one of the things that funders will look for is your track record. Obviously, if you're applying for something quite early on in your research career, funders aren't going to expect to see that you've published loads and loads. They're going to be realistic. But one of the things when funders look at your study, they will look at the quality of the study. Like, is there a genuine problem? Does your solution to the problem look plausible? Is there some good evidence to suggest your solution might work? But they're going to look at the quality of the project, but they're also going to look at the quality of the researcher and the team around you. And having papers that you've published will be one marker of that. I'd also, for publication, nobody writes on their own. Writing papers is part of a team. You could be writing papers, if you think, well, like, what would I be writing up? You can be writing really good papers based on data from your own services to kind of audit, service evaluation, quality improvement reports. So with the appropriate approvals in place, you can be writing up those findings and publishing those in academic journals and building your CV in that way. And just as with the funding bids, journals will often reject papers. They'll almost always not accept them first time round. They'll ask you to go away and revise them. So there is something about developing, I suppose, a bit of a thick skin, expecting papers are going to be rejected. Sometimes with some quite harsh feedback, expecting funding bids might get rejected, sometimes with some quite harsh feedback. So I think for me, the difference between researchers in the NHS who I know who kind of go on and develop a career and those who don't are the ones who kind of aren't the ones who necessarily write better bids or write better papers. They're the ones who, when they get those bids and papers rejected, pick it up, revise it, resubmit it, and keep going. So there is something about that kind of tenacity and persistence that I think is kind of needed. I think if you're going to research in any context, but if you're going to research in the NHS. And then just coming on to real world impact, which is, I guess is first, but I've also put last. So it's just not losing sight of why you want to do the research in the first place. This comes back to, I suppose, when I was saying about what drew me to it almost 20 years ago. Why did I want to be a clinical researcher? And not losing sight of that. And then really thinking about the real world impact. So how can your findings from your research feed back into improving services? Usually when you apply for research funding, that'll be part of the application form. It'll ask about what impact could your research have. But then when you have done the studies, just thinking about, who might be interested in these findings, how can that link into policy? So like I was saying earlier, there's a massive gap between research findings and their implementation in the NHS. And one of the reasons for that is sometimes researchers can do research over in universities and clinicians do their clinical work over in the NHS, and those two things kind of don't align. So research findings that could be implemented don't get implemented for many years. But there's also being realistic about what you can implement. So you might have a really small qualitative study, which might show real promise for, say, a new novel way of working that you've devised, but actually that's probably not enough to say we should change services, but it might be enough to go away and get some funding for the next stage. So I think that was it in terms of my kind of career, I suppose, thinking about my research journey and my reflections. So I just wanted to kind of open up to any questions, and maybe I'll stop sharing as well. So
thank you so much, Clara. That was really helpful and really inspiring. And it's also reassuring that kind of the things that you're mentioning about the need to have that hunger for research, and it's derived from your clinical practice and from your want to improve the services that you provide and the treatments that you offer, but then also having the time, the support, the fact that you're doing it as a team, to have all that reflected and with some really helpful tips and how it has led your journey to the successful position that you're now in. Yeah, it's really great. I see Wendy has her hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was just, Clara, you kept on emphasising about how you can't do it alone and that you need a team. I just wondered if you could give some tips about how you find your team, how you find people and engage them to be involved in any project, and where you find them.
Yes, so I mean, effectively what I did is I found out what research studies were being run in Sussex Partnership, and I found this study that was being led by Paul Chadwick on kind of evaluating this new form of CBT for psychosis. And effectively, and I knew, so Mark Hayward, who's now the Director of Research in Sussex Partnership, he was already part of that study. I didn't really know Mark, but I got in touch with Mark, who I think then put me in touch with Paul, and I kind of just said, is there anything I can do? And I had this half a day that I could use, so I was really lucky. So I sort of found out the study, and I just asked, could I join the team, and I'll kind of help out, and is there anything I can do? And that's when they said, yeah, we actually do need somebody who could maybe come and run some of the therapy groups. And because I had the half a day, I could do that in that time. And then I kind of asked if I could also attend the research team meetings, and I was welcome to attend. So I think that might be something. It's just finding out within your organisation, what are the big research studies that are happening, and could you get in touch, and is there any of your time you could volunteer in return for just things like sitting in on the research team meetings? It's just such an invaluable piece of learning. So if that answers your question, Wendy.
There's a question in the chat from Chris. Chris, I don't know if you feel happy to turn on your camera and talk to Clara directly. If not, I can read out that. Oh, perfect.
Yeah, hi, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm a head of research in Medway Community Healthcare, so we're quite a small research team, but we get lots of clinicians coming to us saying, I've got a really good idea about research, but I've got no idea where to start. And I've never written a bid in my life before. So how do I go about doing that? Can you do that for us? And of course, it's like, oh my goodness. I just wondered what your tips were really, and how you talked about onboarding deep team people. So yeah, just any advice.
Yeah, and that's really familiar. We have lots of people coming to, which is great. I mean, it's great to see people are really enthusiastic. So I think there's a couple of things. One is coming back to the I suppose, just taking a bit of a step back and putting their research idea into the context of what has been done. Because like I said, when I've done that and I've gone away and looked at the published literature, I found, oh, okay, this really novel idea I've had is actually been done. It's been done really well, and I'm not really sure there's a need for me to do a new study. So certainly in our trust, I don't know about in yours, Chris, our library services are really good at supporting people to do a bit of a literature review. So I think I'd almost say the first step is just go away, look at what's been published in the academic literature around this thing you want to do, just to check, is it really novel? I mean, I suppose the thing I would do alongside that, or maybe just after doing that. So if I suppose if you've gone away, you've done that, I think, yeah, this really does feel like there's some mileage in it. The first thing I'd do is put the person in touch with their local research design service, because that's what the RDS is sort of there for. And I mean, yeah, like I said, I wouldn't be where I am without the support of Claire in particular and others. And so I'd say, yeah, I appreciate, yeah, in your perspective, your position, you're not going to be able to do it yourself. So I'd say your role would be more signposting people. So signposting people to the library services and signposting people to sign up with their local research design service. And then the research design service can, you know, offer a lot of support through that process. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Claire.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's right. I think you give me far more credit than I deserve, but I also think that the RDS, like, we exist and we do have skills and expertise in not only grant writing, but what funding might be available and the process, and then kind of supporting researchers and clinicians who see problems that the NIHR will want to fund, hopefully, and how to kind of take them through that process. I mean, the other thing that Clara mentioned was sort of the time, and I can imagine that for most people is a really difficult one, but also being aware of, you know, Clara, you said that it was fairly easy to get half a day a week, which is probably not the case any longer, but that there is awareness that there are pots of money through the ARC, the Applied Research Collaboration, and also from the Clinical Research Network. Sometimes they do small pots of money for independent, development awards that you can buy out. There are also research internships that, again, you can buy out small bits of your time, and also money to access sort of research methods courses to give, especially early career researchers, the time and the skills that they may need to take their research ideas forward.
Yeah, so you're right. So the pots of money that can buy out some of your time. So like I said, the CRN sometimes have those, so keep your eye out for those. ARC have those. Then there's the bridging funding, isn't there, that NIHR can provide, which is if you're looking at kind of a fellowship program, including the pre-doctoral fellowships. I mean, in my experience of speaking to clinicians, one of the problems I think that I'm encountering now that I wasn't encountering a few years ago is if you're able to get funding to buy out some of your clinical time to, say, spend a day a week on research activity, is getting this sign off from your line manager to take that time off. So even if you have the money to backfill your time, I think because the NHS is currently carrying so many vacancies, I think it's carrying 130,000 vacancies across the NHS. That's about 10% of posts. I mean, it's a lot. That I think line managers can sometimes say, even if they have the money, they're reluctant to release people's time. So I think it's harder. I think it's harder even with the funding. But I think getting your line manager involved, and I suppose that comes back to thinking, I suppose what I didn't say, but I think what I would say in relation to that is, if you're in a service where it's going to be difficult to free up some of your time, even if it's funded, to speak with your team, to speak with your manager, to speak with your team lead about what are the research studies that would actually also really benefit the team. So the team can really see, and if we gave you half a week of your time to do this research activity, we could see how it could really benefit the team and the people who use our services.
And I guess what you were saying about, you didn't start applying for grants or for your own ideas. You started by working on a study that was already being run in your trust, you know, as part of someone else's team. And so becoming a site PI for a study that's already been funded and therefore on the portfolio, and that will also benefit your trust in terms of recruitment. And trusts are financially rewarded for that. So again, that might be a good way of, if you're very early on and you're just hungry for research in general, that will then allow you to hopefully get the skills to take your own research ideas forward in the future.
Chris, is that your hand up again? Is that a new hand?
It's a new hand, and you've kind
Yeah,
of sort of answered in what you were discussing there, really, just around the thing that I see quite a lot happening is that difficulty to free up people's time. And even if, you know, we're already sort of piggybacking onto a NHR approved study and there's funding that comes with that, you know, because actually what you're being asked to do is on top of kind of routine care, I can go kind of with, you know, with a pot of money to, you know, services and say, oh, can I buy half a day of one of your physios here or one of your nurses there? But it's that real ability to free them up, really, without kind of dangling that it's in the NHS standard contract that we should be doing research. You don't want to go there because you don't onboard people very well. But I just wondered, from your experience now, Clara, are you still getting that time afforded to you because of what you've shown that you've proved, you know, the benefit of doing what you're doing, really?
Yeah, I am, because I'm in like I'm basically in a full-time research, a clinical academic post. I'm really fortunate, and I don't think those posts are widely available. There are some around, but certainly when I speak to clinicians, it's exactly as you say. I think it is really challenging, and I think there's probably something more to kind of organisational level within NHS services that probably needs to shift around valuing research as a core activity. Like I said, it's there in the NHS constitution, but it's putting that into practice. And I think the way I suppose I sometimes try to put myself into the shoes of like service leads. And I guess as a service lead, you've got sort of short term, medium term, and long term kind of demands, I suppose. And it's often the short term demands are carrying vacant posts, staff being off sick, increasingly long waiting lists. So in the short term, there's the anxiety, I think, as a team lead of, if I free up even one day of your time, then we're going to be then our waiting list is just going to increase, because I'm not going to be able to recruit to that post, and you're just going to have whatever you're going to be able to see, however many fewer people a week. So there's the short term demands. But for me, I think it's about thinking in the medium and long term, which is something I'd really like to see, that actually if clinicians were given more freedom to be involved in research and do research that would benefit their services, not only would we see improved services, but I wonder whether that might feed back into improved recruitment and retention, because I wonder whether there are quite a lot of clinicians who might be attracted to a post and want to stay in a post where they had some time for research as well. So I think for me, it requires a bit of medium and longer term strategic planning, rather than always, and I do get that it's easy for me to say because I'm not in that position, rather than focusing on those sort of short term kind of needs of the service.
Does anyone else have any questions for Clara? There's nothing in the chat at the moment. I wanted, if not, if you could just, the different sort of research projects that you have been involved in or that you have had funded, how have you found sort of the experience with the NIHR versus maybe the smaller pots of money you talked about, versus the different NIHR programs, fellowships, things like that?
I'd say that, you know, I suppose as you'd expect, as the amount of money you're applying for increases, the amount of work it takes to write the funding bid kind of increases. So you're expected to, you know, that there's greater rigor that you're expected to have as you're asking for more money. So for the smaller pots of money, often the application process can be relatively brief and straightforward. And by smaller pot, I suppose I'm thinking of things up to about maybe £10,000 or £20,000. So enough to buy maybe out a bit of your time, maybe a bit of research assistant time to do a study. As you're, I think my experience with NIHR, let me have a think. It's a good question. I think there's a lot of really useful guidance from NIHR about what their different funding streams are looking for, what they will and won't fund. You can get, when you apply to NIHR, you get a lot of feedback from reviewers about your bid, which is helpful, and from the panel.
I think your point about the being persistent and that expect rejection, and it sounds sort of depressing from the outset if you go in expecting to get rejected, but to take it as a sign to revise, make it better, and put it back in. Certainly we at the RDS, we see a lot of things funded, you know, second, third, fifth time around. And the project is probably better for having been through that process of review. And you as a researcher, you become more experienced through that process as well.
I agree. And I don't know, Claire, whether you know what the percentage, I suppose, I know it's different for different funding streams in NIHR, but across NIHR as a whole, what the percentage success rate is.
It is around that sort of 19-20%. What they try and do is that most of the programs have a two-stage application process. So I think they try and get it so that if you're invited to stage 2, you then have a 50% chance.
Yeah.
So sort of half or more than half are funded at that second stage. So, you know, if you do get through the first round, you've got a really good chance then. So paying attention to the good feedback that NIHR gives you to sort of make the changes they want to see. Yeah, but I'd certainly echo that. Almost see the first submission as a chance to get some feedback and comments, and I almost wonder whether it's almost like worth going in with that assumption that it won't be successful without, you know, get it as good as you can, obviously, but you'll often get really helpful, and sometimes not so helpful, but often get really helpful comments from reviewers that helps you revise it. And you might go back to the same funding panel, or you might decide to go elsewhere. And like I said, just keeping in with the research design service, because they'll be really helpful in terms of thinking, do you go back to the same funder? Do you go to a different funder? And the RDS will also know what are the various funding streams that you could be going for as well. Yeah, definitely. And we're getting better at deciphering the comments, because the difference between see it again and can you make these changes? Because I think, again, you made some quite significant changes to one of your studies on the basis of feedback, but were successful after that. Yeah. So the fact that can happen. I've seen Anya very kindly put in the chat some links to the ARC, the Applied Research Collaboration, and also the Clinical Research Network, both of whom from time to time offer some smaller pots of money that people can apply to for things like Clara mentioned, time to do your bits of your own research. Does anyone else have any questions or comments or thoughts that they'd like to raise?
Maybe just a thought, if I may add something. Thanks a lot, Clara, for your, it's always interesting, although I know you a little bit by now, but it's interesting to listen to that story. And I think one of the key things, also being where I am now, is to get help from all sorts of sources, and whether that's the RDS, or colleagues, or, people in your organization or outside. Don't hesitate to contact people, academics or clinical academicians anywhere in the country or even in the world. I think one of the key things is not to be shy, but to be fair and also accept that somebody may not have time at a certain point or whatever. But often people are willing to help, I find. Or at least give you one chance to raise what you want to do and then get their reflections or ideas on it. And sometimes also it helps to go down or avoid going down the wrong garden and ending in a cul-de-sac. That can be happen quite easily. And I think Clara described that very well, with having a great idea, then you notice actually quite a lot of research has been done in an area, and you may want to take a different tack, a different approach to it. Yeah, just sort of general comment,
Okay, and on that note, I've just got a couple of things that I can share with you about where to get help and support and to build your research team. So as Clara said, the NIHR website has lots of guidance and details about its various funding programs and its fellowships, and the guidance notes are helpful in terms of filling out those application forms. Obviously, reach out to the R&D office in your trust, the research office in your university if you're there based. If you're in Sussex, there's the Joint Clinical Research Office that covers the organisations I've put here. On a kind of larger scale in our region, there's the Clinical Research Network for Kent, Surrey and Sussex, which is linked in the chat. And also we've got, we've got 3 clinical trials units now. I need to add the one for Kent, but there's ones in each of our 3 counties if you're looking at designing a clinical trial. And then finally, there's us at the Research Design Service. And we offer free and confidential methodological advice and support for anyone applying for research funding and designing a study. And there's a link here. I think Annie's put it in the chat as well. And you just fill in a form with some basics about who you are and your research ideas. And then one of our advisors, myself, or one of my colleagues will get in touch and help you with everything up to the submission point of your research plan. We've also got a couple of additional events coming up. So every week we hold a drop-in session if you just want to come and have a very informal chat with some research advisors about your various ideas. Please look into that. In a couple of weeks' time, we're doing a particular event on the research for patient benefit programs call for underrepresented disciplines. So if you're a nurse or a midwife in particular, there's a special call for research led by you. And so we've got some more information about that call on the 22nd. And then we're also doing a webinar in April about the various research programs. So all the different funding opportunities available from the NIHR. And then if you're interested in a fellowship, we have a booklet about NIHR fellowships, and these are individual awards as opposed to research team awards. I think that was pretty much everything. I'd like to say thank you so much, Clara, for coming along. Thank you everyone for joining us. And hopefully you'll find this helpful and be in touch. Oh, and there's also, I probably should say as well, please fill out our evaluation form if that's all right. And again, I think Anya will be popping it in the chat for you. So thank you so much, Clara. Really, really appreciate your time and sharing your thoughts, experiences, and your really helpful tips with us.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.